Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session hosted by Arise, the Festival of Left Ideas, as part of the Lenin 100 series, where today we'll be discussing theories of imperialism, how capitalism breeds war, and how, most importantly, we understand the crises we face in order to help us develop activism and a program to transform the world. We're delighted today to be joined by our good friend Grace Blakeley, the author of many acclaimed works, including Vulture Capitalism, which I would highly recommend to anyone who hasn't read it yet. Where have you been, comrades? I would also recommend looking back on sessions with Grace on the Arise YouTube channel that you're looking at now to give further context to our discussion today, especially her event with Jeremy Corbyn earlier in the year, which you can see in the library. It's always a pleasure to have you with us, Grace, and thank you for all your support. In terms of discussing imperialism today, Lenin once said, war is certainly a terrible thing, yes, but it is a terribly profitable thing. And as we look at the carnage of war after wars in recent decades, such as Iraq and Afghanistan, that Britain has been directly involved in, and others like the genocide on Gaza we see on the news each day, which Britain has helped arm and facilitate, well, at the same time we see arms companies raking in billions. These words still seem as relevant as over 100 years ago. So these are the kind of questions we're looking at today on the theories of imperialism and what it means today. And without any further ado, I'll hand over to Grace for a presentation and then be asking her a few questions. Thank you, Grace.
Thanks so much, Matt. It's great to be here. And yeah, thanks for all the great work that you guys do. It's always a pleasure to speak to Arise audiences. So I want to talk today about imperialism as understood from a Marxist perspective and indeed a Leninist perspective. And I'm going to start by introducing a few examples. So first, Zambia. When Zambia gained independence in 1964, it was dependent upon copper exports, and most of its copper mines at the time were owned by foreign corporations. So to kind of ensure that the country benefited from its own natural resources, the Zambian government nationalized large sections of the copper industry and imposed taxes on foreign miners. The taxes ended up capturing the majority of the profits from the exploitation of the country's copper, and these new revenues were channeled into building infrastructure, expanding public services, and subsidizing basic necessities. Copper prices fell sharply over the course of the 70s and 80s, and Zambia was plunged, like many other countries, into a deep debt crisis. Employment and output fell, and taxes dried up, leading to a massive external debt crisis. In exchange for emergency lending, the government was forced to cut public spending, devalue the currency, raise interest rates, and reduce subsidies on necessities. At the nadir of global copper prices, under pressure from the international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, the US-friendly president of Zambia, President Chiluba, sold off most of the Zambian copper sector on the cheap to international investors. The multinationals that purchased these assets knew they were getting an excellent deal, but the government still offered the companies generous tax breaks to ensure the negotiations were wrapped up quickly, in line with the wishes of the World Bank and the IMF. By 1996, 223 state-owned companies had been privatized. Throughout the privatization process, both the Zambian government and the international investors trying to buy its assets were being advised by large international banks and law firms based in the rich world. The government was also under immense pressure from the international financial institutions from which it was borrowing, which were then gripped by a relentless drive for privatization. While the World Bank was holding up the Zambian privatization process as a model for the rest of the world, other observers criticized the process for, and I quote, looting, deindustrialization, deepening debt, and increasing poverty that would emanate from it. The new privatized and now foreign-owned corporations were and are able to avoid substantial amount of tax through loopholes and deductions. This tax avoidance, combined with the low tax rate that the government imposed and financial deregulation, meant that profits were sucked out of that country and into the pockets of shareholders in the rich world. What's more, and as has been the case with many IMF and World Bank-driven privatization programs all over the world, domestic elites walked away from the process with substantial kickbacks, generating visible inequalities that remain a source of resentment in Zambia to this day. Privatization meant that most Zambians didn't benefit from the rebound in copper prices seen after the 1990s. Per capita GDP, fell dramatically, and the trade deficit continued to increase. The percentage of the population that is undernourished increased by 5 percentage points to 50% between 1990 and 2001. Thanks to the decimation of the rest of the economy over the course of the 80s and 90s, by the time the 2008 financial crisis hit, copper accounted for 70% of Zambia's exports. While the economy had had very little exposure to the banks that caused the financial crisis, that didn't stop it from being knocked back by the crash in commodity prices that followed. The country suffered from even higher unemployment and inflation and lower government revenues. As money flowed out of the country, the Zambian government found itself once again unable to service its debts to international creditors. But it was at this point that international finance began to turn the screws on Zambia. First, the pressure came from the mining companies. As the government entered into negotiations with its creditors, the foreign-owned mining sector stepped up an intense lobbying effort to cut its tax liabilities. The government caved and slashed taxes on the sector, as well as giving in to numerous demands for greater allowances, which will make it even easier for these companies to avoid what little tax they still owe. Then the vultures swooped in. In 2007, just as Zambia was concluding an international negotiation to write down a portion of its debt, Donegal International, a vulture fund located in the British Virgin Islands, bought $3.3 million worth of the outstanding debt, sure that Zambia would be unable to repay it. The company then sued Zambia for $55 million for failing to repay its debts, winning $15.5 million in compensation. As one Zambian government official pointed out, paying compensation to this financial institution meant that, quote, the treatment, the Medicare, the medicines that would have been available to in excess of 100,000 people in the country will now not be available. By 2019, many Zambians were actually worse off than they'd been in the 1980s. States like Zambia have been continuously promised that if they just follow the prescriptions of the international financial institutions, they will catch up with the global north. Opening up one's economy is supposed to lead to financial inflows that support development, as mainstream economic models assume that this investment flows from rich countries to poor ones. One of the earliest proponents of openness to international trade was political economist David Ricardo. With his theory of comparative advantage, Ricardo sought to prove that free trade would always benefit both participants in the exchange, rather than only benefiting the seller. When applied to the world economy, this argument had a clear implication. The whole world would be better off if every country produced the commodities for which it had a comparative advantage and traded with other states. But this would only work if every country practiced free trade. If states imposed tariffs, quotas, or other non-tariff barriers, then the costs of trade would increase. The benefits of trade were lost on many of the early capitalist states, which, as Ha-Joon Chang wrote about in his book, provided immense amounts of support to infant industry, including the use of tariffs and quotas. Early industry in countries like the US and the UK developed under the careful guidance of the state. Trade barriers were steadily reduced over time so that these new powerful firms that developed in these conditions of protectionism would be able to enter world markets and compete at the level of the global economy. But newly independent states like Zambia were told that they wouldn't be able to practice this kind of protectionism. They'd have to adhere to free trade policies if they wanted to catch up with the rest of the world. These countries were fed the lie that Britain and America had grown rich through free trade, and that if they opened up their markets to international competition, they'd get rich too. Instead, they found their national economies were dominated by corporations that had themselves been protected by imperialist nations now practicing the benefits of the free market. This is the imperialism of free trade. One of the most ardent champions of this view was Walt Rostow, who in 1960 published his The Stages of Economic Growth. Rostow was born into a family of Russian socialists before becoming one of the most ardent anti-communists in the US government. He took up a strategic role in the military during the Second World War, selecting targets for bombardment to inflict maximum pain on the Germans. And he later joined a government department seeking to deploy psychological warfare against the USSR. He was ultimately invited to serve in the administration of John F. Kennedy, where he campaigned for various ruthless US invasions. He believed that the US could bomb Vietnam into submission, a strategy that led to the deaths of thousands of civilians. His The Stages of Economic Growth proposed a linear model of capitalist development, in which societies progressed through several stages, from the traditional phase, characterized by subsistence agriculture and little technological development, through to the takeoff phase, in which industrialization, urbanization, and capital accumulation all increase, through to the age of mass consumption, associated with high incomes, high consumption, and a growing service sector. The idea was that development everywhere would look exactly as it had done in industrializing Britain. But contrary to the predictions of those who argued that free trade would allow poor countries to catch up with rich ones, the structure of the world economy has remained pretty stable over the last several hundred years. There are a small number of wealthy and powerful economies that dominate the world, a larger number of very poor countries that have little power, and the rest lie somewhere in between. It's true that some countries have been able to move up the hierarchy by industrializing, but in the same way as Britain and America, they've done so by protecting their economies before trying to practice free trade. Marx saw that the inequalities that existed between countries and regions under capitalism reflected the timing of industrialization in each. Some places have been able to industrialize early and dominate surrounding areas, preventing those areas from catching up and leaving them trapped exporting agricultural commodities. The state played a central role in the development of these industrialized areas, not only implementing policies to support infant industry, but also, as Marx noted, enclosing common land to create poor and desperate workers who could be forced down mines and into dark satanic mills. From their emergence in individual nations, these inequalities eventually became visible at the level of the world economy. As Marxist theorist Nikolai Bukharin writes, entire economies appear today as towns, namely the industrial countries, whereas entire agrarian territories appear to be countryside. Economic theory suggests that these differences will eventually even out, because capitalists in rich countries will invest in poor ones as investment opportunities in their home markets dry up. This investment could be channeled into businesses in the global south, allowing them to grow and ultimately challenge the dominance of established businesses in the global north. But mainstream theory didn't account for the growth of powerful monopolies that could dominate their home markets and eventually large parts of the world market. These multinational corporations easily outcompete smaller ones operating in the global south, using their power over the market to price gouge their suppliers, forcing these smaller firms to cut costs by reducing wages and worsening working conditions. And they also often ally with powerful financial institutions to buy up any competitors that do emerge to consolidate their hold over the world market. Companies headquartered in the rich world can also offshore production to poor countries, taking advantage of low labor costs and reshoring the profits to their home nations. Capitalist states make sure these inequalities persist by preventing people from moving around to find better paid jobs and by preventing states in the global south from accessing resources and technology that would help them to industrialize. Together, these processes facilitate the generation of super profits or imperial rents for capitalists in the rich world, as well as stunting industrialization in the poor world and keeping these states in a position of permanent dependency. States are constantly trying to protect their capitalists all over the world. Whether in the form of taxation, trade policy, or foreign policy, capitalists always rely on politicians to provide them with opportunities for profit-making abroad. Lenin, who in 1917 wrote that imperialism was the highest stage of capitalism, realized that this fusion of state and corporate power would make it even harder for poor states to catch up with rich ones. In the 1960s, a group of economists from Latin America drew on Marx's theories of imperialism in response to the errors of modernization theory, as pronounced by theorists like Rostow. Dependency theorists like Raoul Prebisch argued that the world was divided into an advanced industrialized core and a less advanced, predominantly agrarian periphery. Dependency theory was based on the observation that poor countries remained dependent upon producing and exporting primary commodities to and importing manufactured commodities from rich countries. As they developed, wealthy states with large, powerful corporations and sophisticated technologies saw increased productivity translated into higher wages and higher domestic demand. But poor states with less powerful corporations and limited access to technology were forced to keep wages low to remain competitive, hampering domestic development. Over time, the terms of trade between rich and poor countries declined, and poor states were forced to export ever more primary commodities to afford the manufactured commodities they needed from the rich world. States in the periphery then found themselves at the mercy of the commodities cycle, just like Zambia, experiencing severe economic downturns, often coupled with public debt crises whenever commodities prices fell. And because demand for commodities like food is relatively stable, falling food prices don't translate into higher demand. Instead, they just lead to lower revenues for producers. Meanwhile, workers in the core are more productive than those in the periphery, purely because they're working with more advanced technologies and have better training. These factors also mean they have more bargaining power, so they can demand higher wages. and higher wages allow consumer markets to develop more rapidly, creating yet more opportunities for domestic investment for capitalists in the rich world. Dependency theorists like Prebish realize that because of the dynamics of the commodity cycle and the rules and norms promulgated by powerful states and international institutions, peripheral societies remain unable to industrialize in the same way as core states once could. They're trapped in a position of dependency relative to the core. They have no choice other than to export primary commodities to wealthy economies that need them, but they find themselves unable to convert the revenues from commodities exports into the resources required for industrialization. The divide between the core and the periphery is not only a function of different levels of historical development, as someone like Rostow would argue, it is necessary for the functioning of modern capitalism. Capitalists in the imperial core are only able to generate super profits through their hyper-exploitation of cheap labor in the periphery. The hyper-development of the capitalist core comes at the direct expense of the periphery. But rich countries don't just rely on the laws of capitalism to ensure their ongoing hegemony. They have created an entire legal architecture to institutionalize their dominance. Just take the example of investor-state dispute settlements. Texaco, founded in 1902 as the Texas Fuel Company, spent the 1970s and 80s dumping billions of gallons of toxic waste and crude oil into Ecuador's Amazon rainforest, creating one of the greatest ecological disasters in modern history. The spill contaminated vast swathes of the rainforest. Rivers ran black, and an increase in various forms of cancer and birth defects was noted among many of the communities that populated the region. The disaster has been referred to as the Amazon Chernobyl. In 1993, 30,000 Ecuadorians who had been affected by the disaster decided to take action against Texaco. By the time the verdict was delivered, Texaco was owned by Chevron after a merger that had created the second largest oil company in the United States and the fourth largest publicly traded oil company in the world. The Ecuadorians filed a class action lawsuit, and after a legal battle that lasted for nearly 2 decades, Chevron was finally ordered to pay $9.5 billion worth of compensation for the disaster on behalf of Texaco. Immediately following the verdict, the company left Ecuador, selling all its assets and threatening a lifetime of litigation if the government ever attempted to collect the money it was owed. In 2009, Chevron launched an investor-state dispute settlement, ISDS, claim against the Ecuadorian government in the hope of reversing the outcome of the court case. ISDS provisions are written into many international trade and investment treaties, providing protections for investors concerned about governments using their democratic prerogatives to tax, regulate, and prosecute corporations. Under ISDS provisions, investors can take governments to court for unpredictable changes in policy that run contrary to their interests. For example, Philip Morris, the global tobacco company, launched an ISDS in a failed attempt to sue the Australian government after it introduced plain packaging on cigarettes. Although powerful states are sometimes the winners in ISDS cases, multinationals almost always win in cases involving poorer countries. Chevron launched a campaign of targeted intimidation against the lawyer for the Ecuadorian plaintiffs, Steven Dozinger. They hired private investigators to follow him, smeared him in the press, and spent millions of dollars trying to bring Dozinger down through the legal system. The company argued that the initial verdict had been obtained through fraud and accused Dozinger of racketeering under legislation initially introduced to target mobsters. Shortly before the suit went to trial, Chevron dropped the demand for monetary damages, thus denying Dozinger the right to a jury trial. Instead, Chevron accused Dozinger of fraud, relying on the findings of a single judge who frequently ruled in favor of large corporations. In a highly unusual move, the judge allowed Chevron to bring anonymous witnesses. He even barred the defense from mentioning pollution in Ecuador on the grounds that it wasn't relevant to the case. The whole case was full of irregularities and breaches of normal legal proceedings. As one Harvard Law School professor put it, Dozinger has effectively been convicted of bribery by the finding of a single judge in a case in which bribery wasn't even a charge. In another strange set of legal proceedings, Kaplan ordered Dozinger to hand over his phone and his laptop, which Dozinger argued would violate attorney-client privilege. As a result, Kaplan charged Dozinger with contempt of court and placed him in forced confinement, which left him trapped in his house indefinitely. The US attorney refused to follow through on Kaplan's contempt of court proceedings, so he appointed a private firm to bring the case instead, a firm that had previously represented Chevron. The trial destroyed Dosinger's life. He spent 2.5 years under house arrest. His bank accounts were frozen. He was prohibited from earning any money. His passport was seized. When Dosinger lost the case, he also lost his legal license and was sentenced to 6 months in prison. A powerful warning to anyone who dared to stand up to the might of the fossil fuel companies. The ISDS case launched by Chevron in 2009 was ultimately resolved in their favour in 2018. The tribunal ordered the Ecuadorian government to prevent the courts from enforcing the earlier judgment. Chevron has also pushed for the Ecuadorian government to be forced to pay $800 million of the company's legal costs. The campaigning organisation War on Want called the case unprecedented in directly overturning a democratically accountable national court judgment. ISDS is a part of a growing body of international law that, with the active support of powerful states, has helped to routinise corporate crime on a mass scale. The international system contains a massive, powerful, and still largely hidden body of international rules that companies are using to chill government action, coerce policy outcomes, oppose enforcement of legitimate policy measures, and ultimately sue governments if their demands aren't satisfied. They're included in thousands of bilateral trade and investment treaties, creating a parallel system of justice that's heavily biased towards large corporations and in which ordinary citizens foot the bill for lengthy legal battles. Even The Economist, the capitalist journal, balked at the introduction of ISDS provisions, writing, "If you wanted to convince the public that international trade agreements are a way to let multinational companies get rich at the expense of ordinary people, this is what you would do. Give foreign firms a special right to apply to a secretive tribunal of highly paid corporate lawyers for compensation whenever a government passes a law to, say, discourage smoking, protect the environment, or prevent a nuclear catastrophe." Over the last several decades, ISDS provisions have been used successfully to defeat democratic processes in a number of countries around the world. Chemical company Ethel Corp sued the Canadian government when it attempted to introduce a law banning toxic chemicals. The government withdrew the ban and paid $13 million in compensation to the corporation. Metalclad Corp sued the government of Mexico after it refused to issue the company with a permit to build a waste disposal facility as a result of health and environmental concerns. Even in Germany, Vattenfall sued the German government for the introduction of legislation designed to protect rivers from the impact of the company's coal-fired power plants. In one case, documented in the incredible book The Water Defenders, campaigners battling to prevent gold mining in El Salvador defeated an international mining giant in an ISDS case. In other parts of the world, similar gold mining operations had led to the introduction of toxic chemicals into local water supplies, leading to severe health issues. The campaign succeeded and the government called a halt to gold mining in the country. But the mining company that stood to lose the most from this decision took the Salvadorian government to court in response. The book describes the terrifying and bloody ordeal that took place over the course of subsequent years as the mining company, armies of corporate lawyers, and even hired thugs sought to terrorize the water defenders into submission. In a rare victory, the campaigners won, in part owing to their concerted campaign, but in part just because of luck. ISDSs are just one part of the system of rules and norms developed at the international level to keep poor countries poor and rich countries rich. The so-called international rules-based system was designed to promote the power and wealth of rich countries at the expense of poor ones. Whether through the secretive system of international courts, international institutions that exploit crises to force neoliberal policies on poor states, or a financial system designed to discipline disobedient governments into submission, the international rules-based system restricts and undermines development. This is not a problem for the businesses that profit from the exploitation of poor countries and their people. In fact, were it not for these inequalities between the rich and poor worlds, global capitalism could not exist. Empire is, in this sense, about much more than formal colonization. It refers to all the many ways in which the world's most powerful capitalist institutions plan economic activity at the level of the world economy.
Thank you, Grace. That was great. And we'll move on now to a few questions and discussions. I remember actually the Chevron case because we did a number of us at Vulture Rise do a lot of Latin America work, and we were
Yeah.
involved with Friends of Ecuador at that point when Ecuador had the left government under Correa. And there were lots of other examples as well of legal and corporations in Latin America taking the kind of actions you meant. For example, I remember being outside the court in London. This must have been nearly 20 years ago with Jeremy Corbyn and others, because Venezuela had the dispute with ExxonMobil.
Yeah.
And there's other disputes over the years with Bolivia, for example. Elon Musk said that the lithium companies, including the ones that he was involved in, cooed Bolivia to get rid of Evo Morales. So there's
Yeah.
lots of Latin America is somewhere where these examples are very real. You've talked
And I
there
think
about it.
at the moment, sorry, just quickly
Yeah.
to tell your listeners, at the moment, there is a campaign going on in El Salvador to protect those people I mentioned, the water defenders, because the government is now coming for them again. There's a new, very authoritarian government in El Salvador, and it's basically prosecuting a number of different campaigners, including human rights campaigners. And if people want to look up CISPES, that's CISPES, the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, they are launching a campaign at the moment to get international attention focused on this trial against the water defenders.
Well, that's really interesting. That's because obviously one of the things I was looking at the other week was Trump's re-election, and sort of empire personified, I
Yeah,
suppose. And the immediate, very over the top congratulations from Latin America came first from the president for El Salvador with a picture of the two of them
yeah,
embracing, then from Bolsonaro, the ex far right president who's facing a lot of legal issues in Brazil, and then the absolutely disastrous far right president of Argentina, who's kind of on
yeah.
a kamikaze neoliberal on steroids economic approach. And one of the things we're talking about here, I suppose, is the different forms of domination of poor countries, from so-called international norms, which protect corporations or the richer dominating countries, to direct corporate bullying, to attempts to destabilize or smear governments that seek to challenge the system, something
Mm.
else we've seen in Latin America, and more besides. How do you think these sort of indirect, for want of a better terms, forms of colonialism domination linked to a degree, revival of direct forms of intervention and colonialism that we've seen certainly since the 1990s, examples of Iraq and the war for oil there being the most obvious one. And linked to that, in terms of your analysis, how central or otherwise do you see the international arms trade to the functioning of sort of modern monopoly capitalism?
Yeah, really, really significant. There are a lot of examples I look at in the book, Vulture Capitalism, of how this kind of imperial planning that I talk about relies on the kind of overt use of force. So one of the most kind of significant ways that this comes out is if people have read Vincent Bevin's book, The Jakarta Method. It looks at the role of the US government in basically deposing regimes all around the world that the US state believed were kind of contrary to US interests. So there were kind of anti-communist plots all over the world that was supported by the US. Bevins calls it the state organized extermination of civilians who oppose the construction of capitalist authoritarian regimes loyal to the United States. So this happened everywhere, and particularly across Latin America, where hundreds of thousands of people were killed or disappeared in the name of anti-communism. And the US obviously justified this by saying that they were protecting freedom and democracy by kind of opposing communism. But the actions taken to do this often involved kind of exterminating communists and socialists. Indonesia was a really horrific example of how that happened, and Vincent Bevins talks about that at length in his book. Ultimately, there was a historian that found that the number of victims of US-backed violence in Latin America vastly exceeded the number of people killed in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc over the same period of time, which just goes to show the scale of the kind of brutality there. And that violence, which, underpins imperialism, that is necessary basically to protect the structure of the capitalist world system. So if states in the global south have been able to kind of band together and resist the power of the rich world, which is what many of them were trying to do, through, for example, the conferences like the Bandung Conference, the Non-Aligned Movement, the New International Economic Order. All of these were real attempts to kind of promote global South solidarity. Had they been able to get away with that, then they would have been much harder to exploit. So the rich world needs poor countries to remain kind of scattered and underdeveloped. The US has always been willing to act as, the world's, they would say like the world's policeman, but it's really like the policeman of capitalism. This has given rise to, it kind of supports a lot of vested interests in the US as well through the military industrial complex. Private companies are very involved in the expansion of US power abroad. And it's created, this like network of vested interests that benefit from American imperialism. And so public and private institutions kind of work together often when it comes to planning US interventions. And this was really clear actually when it came to Iraq. So one of the first things the US government did with occupied Iraq was sell off state assets. And then, it basically kind of trying to share the spoils of the US invasion with US businesses. And then they tried to introduce legislation that The Economist described as a wish list that foreign investors dreamed of, including lowering the tax rate to 15% and allowing foreign investors to take unlimited sums of money out of the country. This is highlighted in Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, and she describes Iraq as the perfect example of a shock doctrine policy. This is when crises and disasters are used as a means to extract profit and embed capitalist social relations. And that's really what the use of violence to enforce the capitalist world order is all about. Perhaps like the best example of this is Halliburton in Iraq. So US corporations were brought in to run the Iraqi state, including Halliburton, which had 50,000 workers in the region, and KPMG, which was paid $240 million to build a market-driven system for the government. There was obviously the Green Zone in Iraq, which was effectively run as a private city state by Halliburton, charged with managing everything from building roads to cleaning the streets, to even organizing disco nights. Billions of dollars were siphoned out of the pockets of Iraqis and Americans to pay for this kind of corporate American playground. So in this sense, militarism is the cornerstone of empire, and the US military is the cornerstone of that. It is the most important military power in the world, obviously in terms of size, but also when it comes to planning global capitalism and making sure that any threats to the power of capital are undermined even before they emerge. And this also creates plentiful opportunities for private actors to benefit from the US's role as the guardian of global capitalism, and creates this kind of fusion of public and private interests, which makes that military industrial complex so powerful.
Yeah, I think that sort of brings us on to one more thing I think we should discuss because we're here in Britain is the sort of role of Britain and obviously the bloody history of the British Empire and slavery and something is something
Mm.
that's in the news a lot again at the moment around issues of apologies, reparations, and so on. But then also the role of like modern British imperialism in its alliance with the US, come what may, has become very clear by Lamy and Stalmer's rather over the
Mm.
top attempts to make it out like they like Trump all along, which has been both quite amusing and quite sickening, I suppose, for people at the same time. But also here, obviously, discussing the possibility, even in a time of further, yet more cuts from most government departments, wages growth not going to happen. Even the growth they were talking about seemingly not going to happen. Um, Baking in big rises on defence, so-called defence, or better, I'd call military
Mm.
spending, and renewing Trident at an enormous cost as part of a sort of new nuclear war. Do you see Britain's two things, I suppose? One, do you see Britain's role just as a junior partner for the US, or do you think that's a bit simplistic in the kind of world dominated by empire you're talking about? And secondly, how do you think we can link our discussions around economic alternatives, the kind of discussions we've had in your other events you've done with us, to struggling directly against these kind of resources being pumped even more into the war industry directly in Britain?
Yeah, so I mean, I think when we're thinking about the role of the UK in terms of international imperialism, it's less insignificant militarily, of course. Most of our And this is kind of why we end up with this kind of Atlanticism, where we basically act as kind of second fiddle to the United States, based on the idea that we just align our foreign policy with that of the United States, and basically follow it blindly into all of its wild interventions to protect global capitalism, because we're very much aligned with that. But when we're thinking about the role of the UK, it's much more significant in terms of its role at the heart of the international financial system, an international financial system which very much is geared towards kind of promoting these imperialist relations. And what's interesting is the way that the role of the UK, serves also to kind of embed the power of the US economy and US finance as well. Um, because really, when we're thinking about the financial system, the most important part of imperialism probably is the role of the US dollar, as we've seen. The US dollar is the world's reserve currency, which means that central banks have to hold a significant portion of their reserves in dollars. And lots of international transactions take place in dollars. There's the kind of like petrodollar market, where basically since the 1970s, Saudi Arabian oil has been priced in dollars, which creates this cycle of petrodollars in which the US purchases oil from the Saudis, and the Saudis use the resulting dollars to buy weapons from US companies. And this is also facilitated by the UK as well, which has this very close relationship with Saudi Arabia. And then there's the fact that lots of countries and corporations borrow in dollars because it insulates them from currency risk. Um, so this is a significant factor in underpinning the world financial system and global imperialism. And it's reinforced by the UK. So there was the emergence in the UK of Eurodollar markets, kind of decades ago, as far back as kind of the 60s, which was basically a kind of offshore trade in Eurodollars. An offshore trade in dollars. So you could basically trade in dollars outside of the US, and therefore kind of unregulated by the US government. And this basically not only kind of consolidated the role of American imperialism, as well as the role of the city in the international financial system, it also helped to undermine global regulation, which was much stronger when it came to international finance in the post-war period, by basically creating this kind of massive offshore market in dollars that operated out of the UK. The UK's role as a kind of ally to the US, and a kind of blind supporter of US foreign policy, you can also see very much in that kind of financial and economic role too.
Thanks. I think, like, as a sort of last question, and then we can have some closing remarks. Something that I think we've talked about on these calls before, but something that you cover in your books linked to that last bit we're talking about in the UK, well, was the Lucas plan,
Yeah.
which obviously is something from some time ago. But I just thought, like, as the last thing, in terms of something that we can look to in history and something that provides something to the degree of a template of what a positive alternative we could be putting forward. I think especially a lot of our younger viewers won't necessarily know anything
Mm.
about the Lucas plan at all. So I wondered if you could just sort of explain to people what that was and why it's something that you've brought up as relevant to the struggle both
Yeah,
against
totally.
austerity and for peace today. And then if we talk about that for a bit and then can move on to like wrapping it up.
Yeah. So, I mean, I really like talking about this because I think the discussion that we've had shows that basically powerful governments, big corporations, and financial institutions are all in bed together when it comes to kind of planning the world economy, and protecting global capitalism. And that creates a problem because it's like, right, okay, well, if all of those institutions are working together in the same interests, then how are we supposed to kind of create change if we can't just rely on kind of, electing politicians and getting into the state and changing it that way, because there's so many areas of the state that are so deeply implicated in this model. And that's why I really like the example of Lucas Aerospace, because it shows the way that so much can be achieved outside of these of just the state and the private sector. So this was the Lucas Aerospace Corporation, which was kind of around in the 1970s and had been for quite some time, was basically kind of struggling to compete with emerging aerospace giants in other countries. And the the unionists there realized that the company was in trouble. Um, and they were kind of hoping that the government would nationalize the company. Now, this was at the time, in the 1970s, management had been basically trying to like rationalize production in Lucas Aerospace. So it had introduced layoffs and restructuring plans, but nothing was really working. So the unionists in the company went to the Labour government at the time and said, basically, we want you to nationalize us. But this also turned out not to be something that the Labour government believed that it could do at the time. There were also a lot of other economic problems that it was dealing with. So trade unionists from across Lucas went to Tony Benn, who was then the Secretary of State for Industry. And he said, yeah, this is right. We can't nationalize you. But he said, why don't you come up with your own plan to save the firm? So at first, the unionists wrote to academics and policymakers trying to get advice, but they didn't get many responses. So instead, they went to their own workers for ideas, and the response was astounding. So Lucas's workers came up with hundreds of ideas about how to transform the company into a viable and socially useful organization. They had more than 150 ideas for new products, and they brought that together into a document which contained detailed information about all of the resources that would be needed to make this transition, a market analysis, step-by-step plan for transitioning towards a new way of working. And this new way of working was basically based on the idea that the workers would run the company themselves. They would make decisions, they would own the company, and they would kind of share in determining how everything worked. So, the ideas that they put forward as to what this new company would produce, they were basically like, we want to stop producing weapons and start producing socially useful technologies. And this was just completely off their own back. They just said that if we're going to actually take charge of this firm and change things, we want to change what we're doing. So instead, they proposed producing kidney dialysis machines, wind turbines, solar cell technology, hybrid power for cars. This was at a time when human-induced climate change was only really first being discussed, and it was extremely radical. None of the ideas were for military technology, and that had been a key part of what Lucas had been doing up to that point. Management were obviously stunned at this, as was much of the UK government, because these workers had come together across all of the barriers that divided them to create this plan that would save their jobs, transform the company, and create this really big political intervention that would capture people's imaginations. So obviously it was rejected by the firm's senior managers, but the workers would not stop fighting. And they managed to get political support. There was an MP that stood up in Parliament and said, it took the shop stewards 3 years to meet the management to discuss the corporate plan because they were challenging the hierarchical nature of our society, which is that the bosses shall make the decisions and the workers shall accept them. And woe betide workers who question these decisions and perhaps even produce better ones. So this was like an incredibly ambitious document. It challenged the foundational assumptions of capitalism. And because of that, it was kind of roundly greeted with just astonishment by various different parts of the left. So there were the social movements that emerged out of the kind of 68 protest movements. And they loved this because it was kind of challenging traditional hierarchies in the labor movement. Rank and file workers had been disappointed with the post-war consensus, given kind of lower wages and economic problems. So they were excited about it. And lots of people on the left saw worker democracy as a way to kind of deal with the problems that this top-down hierarchical model had created. It was also like the peace movement were excited about it, about undermining the military industrial complex. Environmentalists were excited about it. Even the Financial Times spoke about this in like pretty admiring terms. So this was, a really radical, exciting plan that was based on the idea that workers could basically had the capacity to govern themselves. There was one of the unionists who spearheaded these efforts was called Mike Cooley, and he wrote this book, Architect or Be. And this was drawing on Marx's quote, which I actually reference at the front of the book, which is that a spider conducts operations that resemble those of a weaver, and a bee puts to shame many an architect in the construction of her cells. But what distinguishes the worst architect from the best of bees is this: the architect raises his structure in imagination before he erects it in reality. So this is basically saying like the thing that makes human beings human is the fact that they have this capacity to create, and capitalism alienates that capacity for creativity from them and turns them into kind of these little cogs in these big machines. And what this movement for kind of democratic, socially useful production that emerged with the Lucas Plan in the 1970s, what it was all about was, yes, kind of transforming the economy, moving away from arms, moving towards socially useful technologies, but also giving workers control over that process and giving them a sense of their own power so that they could organize to basically change the world.
Yeah, really interesting stuff, and the kind of ideas of sort of the new society emerging within the old, which is something I think,
Mm,
and how demands and struggles can actually challenge the very foundations of capitalism.
yeah,
I think things that we need to be thinking about much more. And
definitely.
thanks so much, Grace, for doing this with us.
Thanks for
Before
having
I
me.
hand
Great
over
as
to you,
always.
before I hand over to you for the closing marks, can I quickly ask people viewing this for your support by donating at the link provided, and also ask people if they can register for the upcoming and last event in this series, which is with Steve Howe on what Lenin might make of the world today, 100 years on. Um, During World War One, Rosa Luxemburg said, "We stand today before the awful proposition, either the triumph of imperialism and the destruction of all culture, and as in ancient Rome, depopulation, desolation, degeneration, a vast cemetery, or the victory of socialism." I think at Arise, we would argue with the climate catastrophe, as well as wars, conflict, and the nuclear arms race that we talked about today, the choices facing humanity are stark as that again today. And we will have to develop mass movements to understand that and are explicitly anti capitalist and anti imperialist in the phase ahead. I'll now just hand over to you, Grace, for any sort of final conclusions.
Yeah, just, thank you very much for having me today. It was yeah, really great as always to talk to everyone at Arise. And I think the thing to end on is this message of kind of hope and inspiration that comes from realizing that basically, it sounds perhaps even a bit pessimistic, but to say nobody's coming to save us, this idea that we can just rely on electoral politics or just rely on kind of political parties or whatever to deliver good policies or politicians to kind of lead effectively, is really undermined by just looking at the nature of world capitalism, which is this system based on profound, deep collaboration between big governments and corporations and financial institutions. And that the only way we're going to move past that is if we learn to kind of work together, and challenge those power relations everywhere in our workplaces, in our communities, and on the streets. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks, Grace, and thank you everyone for tuning in.